It was supposed to be an ordinary day, another stop on Yaman's promotional tour, another opportunity for fans to meet their idol up close. The venue was packed long before he even arrived. Hundreds of people, mostly young women, waited with flowers, letters, and trembling hands holding their phones ready to capture every second. They expected smiles, handshakes, maybe a few photos. What they didn't expect was a confession that would leave everyone frozen. When Can finally entered, the energy shifted immediately. The crowd screamed, lights flashed, and the air filled with excitement. He looked radiant, calm, yet there was something in his eyes, something softer, heavier. He greeted everyone with his usual charm, that confident smile that had made him a star. But as the minutes passed, it became clear that this event would be unlike any before. At first, everything was lighthearted. Fans asked questions about his upcoming projects, his daily routine, and his life in Italy. Ken answered with humor and warmth. But then, one fan nervously raised her hand and asked, "Do you ever think about the people from your past, people who changed your life?" For a moment, he froze. The room went silent. His smile faded, replaced by a deep, thoughtful expression. You could almost hear his heartbeat. And then, with a quiet laugh that didn't reach his eyes, he said, "Yes. Some people you never really forget." The host tried to move on quickly, but Ken stopped him. "No, let's talk about that for a second," he said, leaning forward. "Because sometimes, fame makes you run so fast that you forget to look back. But certain faces, certain memories, they stay." The atmosphere in the room changed completely. Cameras were still, fans listened in absolute silence. They had never seen him this vulnerable. "There's someone," he continued carefully, "who taught me what honesty and passion really mean. Someone who made me understand that success means nothing if you can't share it with someone who sees the real you." The host blinked in surprise, unsure whether to continue. But Ken went on. "I've made mistakes," he said, his voice lowering. "I've hidden things, stayed silent when I should have spoken. Maybe that's why I'm saying this now." The crowd gasped, and that's when everyone realized, this wasn't just a random answer. This was something deeply personal. The atmosphere inside the hall had completely changed. The flashes stopped. The screaming fans were now silent, their eyes fixed on him, waiting for his next words. Yaman wasn't acting anymore. He was speaking like a man with something heavy on his heart. He took a slow breath and said, "You know, people see the fame, the roles, the travel. They think everything is perfect. But behind all that, there are things you carry quietly, moments you never talk about." His tone was calm, but the pain beneath it was impossible to miss. The host tried to lighten the mood, jokingly saying, "Sounds like there's a story behind that, Can." He smiled faintly, almost sadly. "There always is," he replied. "And sometimes, it's a story you can't tell, at least not completely." He glanced down for a moment before continuing. "There was a time when I thought I could separate my work from my heart," he said. "But then someone came into my life and proved me wrong." Fans immediately began whispering. Everyone knew who he might be referring to, Demet Özdemir. Their connection during Erkenci Kuss had been undeniable, and though both had denied rumors for years, fans never stopped believing that something real had existed between them. Ken smiled faintly as he continued. "She was light," he said softly. "The kind of person who makes everything around her brighter. Even the hardest days felt easy when she was there." The crowd murmured, some gasping quietly. He was describing Demet, everyone knew it. He paused again, eyes distant, as if lost in a memory. "We shared something special, something too real for the world we were in. And maybe that's why we had to hide it. Because once the world starts talking about it, it's no longer yours." The crowd stayed completely still. You could almost feel the collective heartbeat of hundreds of people hanging on his every word. He took a sip of water, then looked straight at the audience. "If I've learned anything," he said quietly, "it's that silence doesn't mean there's nothing to say. Sometimes it means the truth is too precious to expose." Those words hit everyone like a wave. A girl in the front row wiped her tears. Another whispered to her friend, "He's talking about Demet. He has to be." Ken looked around, noticing the emotion in the room. He smiled gently. "You didn't expect that at a meet and greet, did you?" he said jokingly, breaking the tension for a moment. But everyone knew, he wasn't done yet. Because what he revealed next would turn a simple fan event into the most talked about moment of his career. The crowd waited in stunned silence. Cameras were still, phones raised but motionless, nobody wanted to miss a single word. Ken leaned slightly forward, his tone shifting from soft to deeply personal. "There's something I've never said before," he began. "Not in interviews, not in magazines. Because I thought it would be misunderstood. But maybe today. I just don't care anymore." You could feel the tension in the air. Every person in that room seemed to hold their breath. "When you share something real with someone," he continued, "it never truly ends, even if life pulls you apart. Sometimes you carry it quietly for years, and it still finds you when you least expect it." His words hung in the air like poetry, raw, honest, and heavy with nostalgia. He didn't mention any names, but he didn't need to. The emotion said it all. Then he looked up, his eyes glistening slightly. "People often say, just move on," he said. "But how do you move on from something that shaped who you are? How do you forget someone who made you believe in yourself when no one else did?" A murmur spread through the audience. Some fans cried quietly, others simply watched, speechless. Ken smiled faintly again. "We were young. We didn't know how to handle what was happening, the fame, the expectations, the pressure. So we did what we thought was best, we kept it hidden." He paused for a moment, repeating softly, "We kept it hidden for a reason." That line, the same one Demet had once said in her own interview, struck like lightning. The audience gasped. It felt like a connection across time, as if two stories were finally aligning. He continued, his voice breaking slightly. "When I look back now, I don't regret a single moment. Because even if it was short, even if it ended, it was real. And real things don't fade." The host gently placed a hand on his shoulder, visibly moved. "That sounds like something that stayed with you," he said. Ken nodded. "It did. You don't forget the people who helped you become who you are." The applause that followed wasn't loud, it was soft, respectful, emotional. The crowd wasn't reacting to a celebrity anymore. They were responding to a man showing his heart. And just when everyone thought it was over, Ken looked toward the back of the hall, as if remembering something. "You know," he said, "once in a while, life gives you a chance to cross paths again. And when that happens, you realize some stories never really ended." The host tried to speak, but the audience was already reacting, gasps, whispers, a few tears. Everyone knew what he meant. The tension in the room was unbearable. Every fan could sense that what was coming next would be unforgettable. Ken smiled faintly, trying to lighten the moment, but his voice trembled when he spoke again. "I didn't plan to say any of this," he admitted. "But sometimes, when you see so many faces that have supported you for years, you realize you owe them honesty." He paused, looking around the hall filled with emotional fans. "You've seen me in so many roles, but the truth is, the most real moments of my life weren't in front of the camera." He took a deep breath. "There was one moment, years later, when we saw each other again. It wasn't planned, it wasn't public. Just fate." The crowd gasped softly. Some fans covered their mouths, already guessing who he was talking about. Ken continued, "It was at an event, actually. I turned around, and there she was. Same smile. Same calmness. And for a second, it felt like time had stopped. I don't think either of us knew what to say." He smiled to himself, lost in the memory. "We talked for a few minutes, nothing too deep, but in her eyes, I saw it. The same truth we never dared to speak. That what we had wasn't fake. It was real. And maybe that's why it scared us so much." The audience stayed frozen, some crying quietly. The host didn't interrupt this time. He knew everyone in the room was witnessing something special, something genuine. Ken then looked back at the crowd. "You know," he said softly, "we all make mistakes. We all let people go when maybe we shouldn't. But sometimes, love isn't about holding on. It's about being grateful that it happened." He smiled gently, his voice warm but heavy with emotion. "I'm grateful," he said. "For everything, for the laughter, for the silence, even for the distance. Because every story, even the ones that end, teach you who you really are." The room erupted into quiet applause. Fans stood up, some clapping, others simply holding their phones to their chests, unable to speak. Ken nodded to them, visibly moved. "Thank you," he whispered. "Not just for being here, but for understanding that behind every story you see on screen, there's a heart that beats, and sometimes breaks." And with that, he stood up, gave a final smile, and left the stage. The lights dimmed, the audience still in awe, trying to process what they had just witnessed. It wasn't a show anymore. It was a confession, one that no one expected, but everyone would remember. When the event finally ended, the air in the hall felt different, heavier, quieter, almost sacred. People weren't rushing to the exits like they usually did. They stood still, staring at the empty stage where Yaman had just opened his heart. Outside, the night was cool and calm. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, but Ken didn't answer. He just smiled faintly, waved to the fans waiting outside, and walked toward his car. Those who were close enough said he looked peaceful, not sad, not regretful, just free. Inside the hall, fans were crying, hugging each other, replaying the moment over and over on their phones. "Did you hear what he said?" one whispered. "He finally admitted it," another replied. Within hours, clips of his confession flooded social media. The headlines were everywhere. Yaman breaks down during meet and greet, the confession that shook his fans, he still thinks about her. For the first time in years, it wasn't about fame, or image, or gossip, it was about truth. A raw, human moment from a man the world thought they already knew. Those close to Ken later said he spent that night alone, walking along the Bosphorus, the city lights reflecting on the water. They said he looked thoughtful, almost nostalgic, as if every word he had spoken was still echoing inside him. Maybe he was remembering the laughter, the long nights on set, the silent goodbyes, or maybe he was simply grateful that he had finally let it all out. He didn't post anything that night. No photos, no captions. Just silence. But fans knew what that silence meant. It was the sound of closure, and of something real that would live on quietly, even if it was never spoken again. Because sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is tell the truth when no one expects it. And that's exactly what Yaman did. His confession wasn't a scandal. It wasn't drama. It was love, pure, complicated, unfinished love, the kind that doesn't need an ending to stay unforgettable. And as the headlines kept spreading across the world, one fan wrote the comment that summed it up perfectly: he didn't confess to get attention. He confessed because after all these years, his heart finally needed peace. That's the real story behind that day, the day when the world stopped seeing a star and saw the man behind the fame.